In Chapter 3, we are going to discuss speaking confidently. One of the biggest issues that comes up in any public speaking class is nervousness, or what's known as communication apprehension. So we're going to talk about that some, realize how to identify it, and then offer some tips on how to address it. So several things we're going to talk about is what is communication apprehension, the sources of it, reducing communication apprehension, and then coping with unexpected situations. One of the things that you should know is that if you have a fear of public speaking, you aren't alone. Many people, the majority of people, have some fear of public speaking. Even people who speak on a regular basis and professionally still deal with stage fright. So know that it's something that's normal, but the good news is that there are tips that we can manage during that time. So in section 3.1, we talk about just what is communication apprehension. It's a really broad term that refers to someone's fear or anxiety associated with either real, so you know that you're going to give a speech, or anticipated communication. You think that you're going to go to an interview, for example. It's a psychological response, so it is psychological, but it has very real physiological effects that we're going to talk about. And one of the good things is that if we know how our body responds to stress, especially in those situations, we can develop better coping mechanisms to deal with it. So some of the physical effects that you've probably experienced, and it's important to note that you may experience communication apprehension speaking in front of an audience. Some people have very real communication apprehension with other communication situations, such as going to a job interview or answering the phone. So some of the effects are sweating, your heart can pound, you feel weak or shaky, you feel like there's butterflies in your stomach, and dry mouth. The good thing is that feeling is the same as excitement. So if any of you play athletics or do any sort of competitive activity, you'll notice that you usually feel nervous or that excitement before the game or the competition begins. And you can channel that energy to help you. It's the same thing when we're looking at public speeches. There are several common pieces of advice that you'll hear that are very misleading, like imagining your audience naked is not a good thing. You want to focus on your audience and try to connect with them so it's more of a conversation. Couple of sources of communication apprehension. Trait anxiety is just in general how people feel. So regardless of the situation, I feel nervous when I think about communicating. If I feel nervous one-on-one with people, I feel nervous in front of a classroom, I feel nervous talking on a phone. In general, the idea of communicating with others makes me feel anxious. Context anxiety, on the other hand, refers to specific context, and those are usually dependent on three things. So how formal the situation is. So for example, if I know I'm speaking in front of an audience and it's a very formal setting, that might make me more nervous than not. How much uncertainty there is going into it. So if I don't know anything about the situation, if I don't know anything about the interview I'm going into, that uncertainty can create a lot of anxiety. And then if it's something new that we don't have experience with, we're going to experience anxiety. So there's trait anxiety, which is just in general connected to the person. And then there's context anxiety, or sometimes it's called situational or state anxiety, and it's dependent on the actual situation. Audience anxiety is when you are just anxious based on the audience, and it can vary depending on audience. So you might feel comfortable speaking to a group of your peers, but you may not feel comfortable speaking to a group of teachers, for example. And so that usually is dependent on several factors. One is how similar you are to an audience. So if you're able to connect with them, maybe you don't have as much anxiety if you aren't. The subordinate status, are you speaking to your peers? Are you speaking to a boss or somebody that has higher power than you? Audience size, typically as the audience gets bigger, the speech gets more formal. And so that also creates some additional anxiety for people. And then just familiarity. How familiar are you with both the audience that you're speaking to, the different people in it? You may be completely comfortable speaking at an FCA event if that's something you're involved in, but you aren't comfortable speaking, to entire student body. So there's some differences there where the audience that you're speaking to changes your anxiety levels. And then situational anxiety is just communication apprehension that's created by the combination of things like the audience, time, and context. So maybe you're really nervous if you had to speak at a funeral because you want to make sure that you're giving the person proper respect, or you want to make sure that the meeting is meaningful. The context of that can definitely affect things. Some things that you can do for nervousness we're going to talk about are both things you can do prior to the speech and things you can do in the speech themselves. So prior to the speech, one of the best things you can do is what's called cognitive restructuring, which is a fancy term for changing how you label your response. So instead of seeing it as nervousness or that you're going to do terrible, try thinking positively, look at it as excitement. Those sort of things can really help you if you focus on the message instead of the fact that you're giving a speech. Any of those positive elements can help you develop a speech more confidently. Biggest thing you can do is to prepare, spend time preparing good information that's organized, that's meaningful, and spend time preparing in terms of practicing the speech, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Try to find out as much information you can about your audience. Remember, some people feel a lot of anxiety when it's uncertain. So the more information you can find out about your audience can help. Also let you connect to them more, which is going to help it feel more like a conversation. One of the things that you want to focus on is practicing extemporaneous or conversational delivery. You don't want to read to us. You want it to sound like a conversation with the audience. So work to speak naturally. I don't want you to say word for word what's on your outline. I want you to look at a few notes and be able to just tell us in your own voice and language what you want to talk about. If you can, practice very similar to how you present. Some of the biggest mistakes that speakers have made are practice the speech all in their head, or they practice it sitting down. If you're using visual aids, practice standing up using visual aids. Being able to walk through that, work out the kinks in that is going to be very helpful. And then I would also encourage you, one of the things that your book talks about is watch kind of what you eat right before you give a speech. You don't want to be caffeined up and be super jittery. Probably don't want to have a lot of carbs that are in your system, those sorts of things. So just think about some of those things that you can enact prior to the speech. During the speech or right before the speech, you can do some things like take slow, deep breaths before you get up to speak. Try to include movement. If you're standing in one place behind a podium, for example, makes you very aware of that. You want to incorporate movement that makes sense for your speech, but movement really helps you work out some of that anxiety. You may consider doing some of the vocal warm-ups or relaxation techniques that the book talks about. Try to really focus on your audience and not yourself. So don't focus on the fact that you feel very nervous. Try to focus on the audience and your ability to share with them what you want to share about the topic, which is why it's important to choose a topic that you care about because it makes it easier to focus on the message that's there. Things are going to happen sometimes, so just try to maintain a sense of humor. And then again, a positive visualization is very important. So try to see yourself giving a successful speech, use positive self-talk instead of negative self-talk. There may be some things that go wrong sometimes, and we're going to talk about a couple of those. So sometimes there are speech content issues. If you're going through your speech in the presentation and you realize that you've forgotten something, remember your audience does not have your manuscript or your outline in front of you. So just take a minute and pause. Think through your options. You know, is this information that I have to include? How can I include it? And then move on. It'll be okay. You don't want to draw attention to it. It's better to pause than it is to say and or I'm sorry, I forgot something. Let me go back. Just pause, gather your thoughts, decide what you want to do, and move on. Sometimes you have technical difficulties. The biggest piece of advice I can offer you is to have a backup plan. Presentation aids are great, but you don't want to rely on them. So if your PowerPoint goes down or doesn't work, you want to make sure that you can still deliver the speech without it. And then sometimes you may experience external distractions. You can ignore them, or you can pause and wait for the distraction to end. So if there's some loud noise outside or someone walking in, the biggest piece of advice is that in all cases, you want to take a deep breath and try to maintain composure. So these aren't the only steps that are available to help with nervousness, but it is a good start, and I would encourage you to try to incorporate some of them. The biggest piece of advice I can give you is spend adequate time preparing and practicing the speech, and try to connect to your audience, and you'll do great. Thanks.